he spoke about a couple of things. One thing that got a little bit of a reaction from you, Pam, was he called this meeting the modern version of the historic council that occurred just after the Royal Proclamation of 1763. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's just completely insulting to compare the Covenant Chain Council and the promises and exchanges that were made then to this meeting and the lack of participation by most First Nations.
The PM is coming up to the podium. I've been told that he might be giving part of his speech in Blackfoot. So we'll listen for that.
Of the Algonquin to this historic Crown First Nations gathering. And it is especially appropriate to do so in this building. An édifice dont le nom honore la mémoire du Premier ministre John George Diefenbaker, the initiator of the modern era of First Nations Crown relations. A building whose name honors the memory of a Prime Minister who cared deeply about the things we are gathered here to talk about today: respect, rights, and opportunity for First Nations Canadians. John George Diefenbaker was, in many ways, the initiator of the modern era of Crown First Nations relations. It was he who named the first First Nations member to the Parliament of Canada, Senator James Gladstone, in 1958. And, of course, it was he who 2 years later extended to Aboriginal Canadians living on reserves the right to vote in national elections. In addressing that long-standing and fundamental injustice, he was a man ahead of his time and, in many ways, an apt inspiration for today's proceedings. Bonjour à vous tous qui êtes sur place et qui participent. Welcome to you all here and to all those participating throughout Canada, here in Ottawa and across the country. His Excellency Governor-General Johnston and Sharon Johnston, Minister Duncan, Secretary Rickford, Senators and Members of Parliament, distingués invités, elders, chiefs, including, if I might draw a special attention to, including Chief Weaselhead and Peter Standing Alone from my home First Nation, the Blood First Nation of Southern Alberta. And, of course, National Chief Atleo. It is in no small part the vision and conception of the National Chief that has led to this gathering today, and I all know we congratulate him for that leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, hier marquait le 6e anniversaire de l'élection générale dans laquelle les Canadiens et les Canadiennes sont confiés
the general elections when Canadians, for the first time, put their country in the hands of our government.
These past 6 years have been a time, to put it mildly, of distractions, of elections, of minority parliaments, and, of course, world economic and financial crises. Malgré cela, notre gouvernement a travaillé fort.
Despite this, our government has worked hard to resolve issues that have concerned members of the First Nations of Canada for a long time, and I believe the work that we have done together to now gives us an opportunity now to strengthen our relations and to unlock economic opportunities for Aboriginal Canadians.
Our government has, nevertheless, through these times, worked hard to deal with matters of abiding concern to members of Canada's First Nations. And I believe that as a consequence of our work together thus far, we have exciting opportunities to strengthen our relationships. More than that, such will be the demand for labour in our future economy that we are positioned today to unlock the enormous economic potential of First Nations peoples, and to do so in a way that meets our mutual goals. Canada's growing and vibrant economy will require a skilled and growing labour force in every region, urban, rural, and remote. Aboriginal Canadians, Aboriginal peoples, are Canada's youngest population. It is therefore in all of our interests to see Aboriginal people educated, skilled, and employed. And there will be no better point in history to ensure that that happens than now. Now, in a moment, I will come back to that. First, however, I must say this. Toute relation a ses hauts et ses bas. toute relation est marquée par des consensus et des désaccords. Mais je crois que dans toute relation, il est important de mettre l'accent sur les moments forts et la relation entre les Premières Nations et le Canada en compte plusieurs. Every relationship has its ups and downs, moments of consensus and of disagreement. I believe it is important to build the narrative of any relationship based on its highest points. In the relationship of First Nations with Canada, there are some very high points. We have, of course, all of the historic treaties, large and small. Nous avons la première réunion entre le gouverneur Champlain et les Autochtones. En effet, le premier exemple des relations rassemblement de la couronne et des Premières Nations. We have the Royal Proclamation of 1763, of which we will mark the 250th anniversary next year, a foundation of the Crown First Nations relationship. We have, of course, the 200th anniversary this year of the War of 1812, in which Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples joined under the Crown, ultimately laying the basis for a distinct country in the northern half of this continent. And, of course, all the wars since, in which Aboriginal people have always fought alongside their fellow Canadians in defense of freedom and democracy here and around the world. These are great things on which to build. Cela dit, nous devons aussi reconnaître qu'il y a eu des moments moins réjouissants, des moments très difficiles. En réalité, pour des générations, la relation entre nos peuples a été assombrie. Elle a été assombrie en particulier par le fait que des enfants autochtones ont été forcés de fréquenter des pensionnats. Nonetheless, we must acknowledge the not-so-uplifting moments, some very low points, and the reality that for generations, the relationship between our peoples was tainted. Tainted in a manner that eroded trust and blocked ways forward, as does a tree fallen across the road. Tainted in particular by the experience of the forced residential schools, the explicit attempt to destroy Aboriginal culture and to dismantle the Aboriginal family that wounded so many so deeply. That's why one of my most rewarding days in office was when I rose in the House to deliver an apology to those students. Nous avons reconnu ce triste chapitre dans notre histoire. Nous avons répudié le raisonnement qui se trouvait derrière cette période qui a blessé beaucoup de gens profondément. We acknowledged that sad chapter in our history. We repudiated the thinking that lay behind it. And we went beyond symbolism. We took concrete action to settle the claims of those who had been injured. That, ladies and gentlemen, concrete action has been our election promise to First Nations people in 2004, in 2006, in 2008, again in 2011. And to those commitments we have been faithful. En plus des excuses présentées pour les pensionnats et l'accord d'indemnisation, notre gouvernement a aussi, par exemple, accéléré le règlement de plusieurs revendications. For example, our government has addressed historic grievances by accelerating the settlement of both comprehensive and specific claims. In concert with the Assembly of First Nations, our historic new process has allowed more than 65 specific claims previously held up for decades to be dealt with thus far. We've extended the full protection of the Canadian Human Rights Act to First Nation Canadians living on reserve. As a government, we seek to promote the full participation of First Nations in Canada's political and economic life with all of its rights and responsibilities. And we are dealing with things that have been in the talk shop for 20 years, in some cases longer than that. We are, for instance, about to ensure that the property of First Nations women and children is protected when relationships end. We've tabled bills to strengthen First Nations governance with 21st century rules on elections and transparency. Many First Nations people will say it's about time.
Nous avons versé aux communautés des Premières Nations et du Nord plus d'1 milliard de dollars dans le cadre du plan d'action économique. We routed more than $1 billion of economic action plan funding to investments for Aboriginal and Northern communities, using one-time stimulus money to accelerate the building of new homes and water and wastewater systems in order to improve living conditions. And soon, we shall secure water system accountability through legislated standards. In the name of self-government, we've devolved land and resources from Ottawa to the Inuvialuit. To protect children, we've brokered 6 child and family service agreements between Ottawa, First Nations, and provincial governments. Et, bien entendu, nous avons endossé la Déclaration des Nations, nous avons endossé la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. And, of course, we endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This reaffirms our aspiration and our determination to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples at home and abroad. These things we have done, ladies and gentlemen, as a down payment on what we wish to achieve. Parce que nous visons l'autosuffisance des citoyens et l'autonomie des communautés. For our goal is self-sufficient citizens and self-governing communities. Our goal is to promote improved governance. Our goal is much increased Aboriginal participation in the economy and in the country's prosperity. And we have no illusion about the enormous work that lies ahead of us. Les actions et les réalisations de notre gouvernement au cours des 6 dernières années témoignent du sentiment d'urgence qui nous anime. Mais laissez-moi vous dire ceci, ce n'est qu'un début. Our government's actions and accomplishments during the last 6 years speak to our sense of urgency. But I can tell you this, we have only just begun. In terms of participation, standard of living, quality of life, the time has come for First Nations to fully share with other Canadians from all walks of life, with equal opportunity to find the dignity of gainful employment, and more than that, the ability to raise a family and the security that comes with it. This is our goal as a government for all Canadians, and where it is not working for First Nations, we must act aggressively, and act together. Cela m'amène à parler du plan d'action conjoint Canada Premières Nations, un plan adopté l'an dernier par le gouvernement du Canada et l'Assemblée des Premières Nations. Il s'agit d'une entente opportune fondée sur des objectifs et des principes communs. That brings me to the Canada First Nations Joint Action Plan, agreed last year between the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations. This is a timely understanding based upon common goals and shared principles. Principles such as respect and transparency, goals like the empowerment of individuals, strong sustainable communities, and economic development. I call it timely because, as I said earlier, there has never been a better moment to build on what we have achieved, to move forward, to reset the relationship, to learn from the past, but to focus on the future. Le plan d'action conjoint trace la voie à suivre au moyen d'engagements communs, des engagements qui vont changer efficacement les règles régissant les relations au chapitre de l'éducation, de la reddition des comptes, du développement économique et des traités. This joint action plan points the way ahead through specific joint commitments that will effectively change the rules in education, accountability, economic development, and treaty relationships. Why would we wish to change the rules? Because from the rules you set come the results you get. And the incentives buried in the Indian Act self-evidently lead to outcomes that we all deplore. To be sure, our government has no grand scheme to repeal or to unilaterally rewrite the Indian Act. After 136 years, that tree has deep roots. Blowing up the stump would just leave a big hole. However, there are ways, creative ways, collaborative ways, ways that involve consultation between our government, the provinces, and First Nations leadership and communities, ways that provide options within the Act or outside of it for practical, incremental, and real change. Voilà notre approche, remplacer certains éléments de la loi sur les Indiens par des dispositions et des procédures plus modernes en partenariat avec les provinces et les Premières Nations. C'est une approche qui s'est déjà révélée prometteuse. Et certaines Premières Nations ont déjà fait des progrès remarquables. So that will be our approach, to replace elements of the Indian Act with more modern legislation and procedures in partnership with provinces and First Nations. It's an approach that has already shown promise. With inspired leadership, energy, and enterprise, some bands have already shown that First Nations people are as quick to prosper, as capable of excellence, and as able to enjoy all that Canada's vibrant economy has to offer. I think of BC's Haisla First Nation, partners in the massive Kitimat LNG project that will deliver training, employment, and rich economic and social benefits to the community for decades to come. Or the Whitecap Dakota First Nation, who under the First Nations Land Management Administration have almost zero unemployment. Or the Alberta First Nations, whose band-owned companies do hundreds of millions of dollars a year in business with oil sands producers employing thousands of Aboriginal people in skilled, high-paying jobs. Or in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Mio-Bukik First Nation, which has developed a unique job creation program for unemployed community members, operating in surplus, despite having few revenue sources of their own. Ou au Québec, la Première Nation de Sepit a su développer ses industries en tourisme et dans la pêche commerciale, créant ainsi des emplois locaux et des partenariats tant avec le privé qu'avec les municipalités voisines. Je pense que nous pouvons faire encore plus que ce que nous imaginons ou croyons possible en ce moment. However, none of us, not governments, not First Nations communities, not Aboriginal individuals, can accomplish these things alone or without the others. In past conversations, we've talked about symbolism and respect and trust. Certainly in the past, lack of trust on both sides has held us back. But this is a new day. New generations are arising, generations that seek a common vision, that have common goals. Et la plus grande marque de respect que nous pouvons présenter aux hommes et aux femmes des Premières Nations, c'est de leur fournir les outils dont ils ont besoin, de leur reconnaître les capacités nécessaires et de leur permettre d'aller de l'avant. And the greatest respect that we can show to First Nations men and women is to provide them with the tools they need, with the credit them with the capacity, and then allow them to move forward. All we all need to move forward. So let us be willing partners. Let us use this opportunity to renew the conversation. I look forward to the outcomes of your deliberations. Ixo capit. Merci beaucoup, mes amis. Thank you, friends.
All right, so the Prime Minister is just wrapping up his speech there. Pam, your thoughts? Real quick. We only just before the National Chief gets up there.
Well, it's pretty clear. He's minimized the impact of colonialism on First Nations. He's focusing on the same assimilatory agenda advanced by Tom Flanagan, individuals, and that's where they're headed.
Mm-hmm. Doug, what was your thoughts?
Well, he painted a pretty rosy picture. He didn't mention Attawapiskat once, didn't mention a lot of the inner city problems we have, and he didn't mention a lot of the other issues that we have.
Yeah.
Yes, well, you know, there's many people who say that this meeting came about because of Attawapiskat, so it is very interesting.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Okay, well, here's the National Chief. We'll listen to his speech.
We are gathered here on an historic day. An historic day in the midst of urgent needs and demands on us all. On behalf of our First Nations leaders here and across Canada, we greet the Crown in the spirit of our ancestors, with sincerity and with the pride of all of our Indigenous nations. At this gathering of our leaders and yours, recalling our earliest interactions. Chu utlasish a inchat, histakshit a hoset nu chanotlet tlakishpit maas. A tikshit sisi hathatwe hiksu algonquin. Ma chinopsik, ma tikitsu. This is our way, by way of introduction. I am a inchat from Ahousaht, from New Tonalth, from the West Coast. And we begin, as our people do, by acknowledging the territory of the Algonquin people. Miigwech to Elder Bertha Commanda, and the leaders of all of the Algonquin. It was, as has been referenced here, the Algonquins who greeted newcomers to their lands on the shores of the Ottawa River in front of us here. Bertha and today's Algonquin chiefs carry forward that tradition of leadership. Their Excellencies, Governor General David Johnston and Mrs. Johnson, your presence here is an essential feature of our gathering. It reflects the solemn commitments made to uphold the honor of the Crown. Your participation recalls the sacred alliance between our ancestors, the leaders of First Nations and of the British Crown. Prime Minister Stephen Harper, let me express my personal thanks to you for the leadership that you've shown in making this historic gathering possible. Together, all the leaders here gathered, the ministers, members of Parliament, senators, and hundreds of First Nations chiefs are making a solemn and public commitment to our people and to all Canadians to this new beginning, and we must not fail. Today must mark the beginning of renewal, the beginning of realizing our shared potential, foretold in the visions of our ancestors. But the proof of our commitment will begin tomorrow, and in the weeks and months ahead, demonstrating that this time, this generation of leaders will not fail to make the changes that we know are urgently needed. I understand that there will be some who regard today's events with skepticism. I know there will be Canadian and First Nations people who will see this as merely another event promising much and delivering little. I understand those feelings. I respect the skepticism. It would be disrespectful of the suffering of our peoples over 2 centuries of agreements, followed by broken promises, if I did not. There will be others who will say, why do you need this meeting? Why not just get on with it? My answer is simple. Because first, we must repair, as has already been said here, the trust that has been broken. To renew the partnership, we need to rebuild the trust on which it must be based. It is up to us, all of us, to ensure that this time we deliver new hope and new opportunity, not the bitter ashes of disappointment to our peoples. I pledge myself to this task, to the hard work ahead, to full acceptance of the responsibility and accountability of First Nations that we have in this new beginning. I respect the commitment made by the Prime Minister on behalf of the Government of Canada. We have made promises in public today before all our peoples. Their disappointment, if we were to fail to win real progress, would be powerful and understandable. Today's gathering reminds that our leaders then had the courage and the wisdom to fight for a vision, a better future delivered through partnership and through alliance. Our treaties are the sacred proof of that vision and of their shared commitment. On a day such as this, it is important to recall those leaders, to recall their courage. Indigenous nations were powerful, politically, economically, militarily. Our nations were sovereign and recognized as such. Leaders of our nations and those from Europe approached these relations with openness, with confidence and conviction to secure our collective futures. First Nations communities stood shoulder to shoulder with newcomers. We ensured their survival through our generosity and sharing of the wisdom of the land. As has been said here, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, it built on decades of treaty making in the East, codified the Crown's obligations, and established treaty making as an essential requirement for obtaining access to our lands and to our resources. The Royal Proclamation was a direct result of concern over Pontiac's rebellion and the need to assure Indigenous nations that our land rights would be secure under the British Crown. It is no exaggeration to say that without the courage and military skills of First Nations leaders and warriors in the War of 1812 that followed, Canada might be a very different place today, and we always honor our veterans. Our ancestors were central to every campaign and to the ultimate victory. Among the many breaches of that commitment was the Indian Act of 1876. Built on a disgraceful premise of our inferiority, aimed at assimilation and the destruction of our cultures, it was a complete abrogation of the partnership between respectful nations. Largely unchanged, it remains a painful obstacle to reestablishing any form of meaningful relationship. It is well past time that we begin to undo the damage that act has inflicted on our peoples and to our partnership. For from it grew the reserve system, the tragedy of the residential schools, and offensive prohibitions on our cultural and our spiritual practices. A breach of faith that has devastated families and communities ever since. As the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples concluded now over 15 years ago, that this legislation has utterly failed our people, and indeed it's failed Canada. Despite these attacks on our history, our culture, and on the partnership of treaty peoples, our nations, as we can see here today, our peoples fought on. We continued to support Canada when its survival was under threat. First Nation soldiers were among the first and the most courageous fighting in every major conflict Canada has fought, and this continues to this day. Indeed, it was those very veterans who forged our First Nation organizations, including the Assembly of First Nations, over 40 years ago. Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth, has affirmed our treaty relationship. She said, "You may be assured that my Government of Canada recognizes the importance of full compliance with the spirit of your treaties." Justice Lord Denning, during the constitutional patriation debates, affirmed the integrity and durability of the First Nations Crown relationship. The 1982 Constitution Act underlined this historic partnership, including the recognition and affirmation of treaty and inherent rights as the supreme law of the land. This year marks the 30th anniversary. Rather than an empty box, the Supreme Court of Canada has affirmed Section 35 as a solemn commitment that must be given meaningful content. It is imperative, then, that we move forward on this basis, the basis of recognition and affirmation, not denial, not extinguishment. The historic apology, made possible by the leadership of Prime Minister Harper, set the course for reconciliation, a journey together that helped enable today's gathering. My own late grandmother, with whom I witnessed the apology as we were holding hands, turned to me and said, "Grandson, they are beginning to see us." With the usual clarity and wisdom of our elders, she summed up the challenge and she foretold the work ahead of us. Just 2 years ago, Canada endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada's endorsement must be taken with full sincerity and must take us forward on a path to reconciliation. And this work we will undertake together. It cannot wait. We need only to look to Attawapiskat, Martin Falls, Pikangikum, and St. Teresa Point, among dozens of other communities on reserve and in our cities, to see the impact of broken promises, the pain of broken lives, the tragedy of lost opportunity. Our people cannot wait. They insist that we stop lurching from crisis to crisis. They ask us to begin anew, to rebuild understanding and trust as the way forward. Indigenous nations have come together to support one another. late Shuswap Grand Chief George Manuel advanced the critical connections between Indigenous peoples across Canada and around the world. He forged a shared vision amongst First Nations throughout Canada, including the monumental campaign to oppose the 1969 White Paper. 40 years ago, under his leadership, First Nations called for Indian control of Indian education. Today, we stand firm in our convictions and take this vision forward. I see it in the eyes of our young leaders who are fighting for change. I hear it in the words of support and encouragement from Canadians in all walks of life, including those of faith groups who've told us that they are praying for us today. And I am hopeful in the commitment of our Crown partner to gather with us to begin the important dialogue. I see it in the work of our leaders who have broken through the barriers of the past to develop exciting new plans in education, in health and economic opportunity. At the centre, though, remain our treaties and our relations, just as they did centuries ago. Respect for and sincere implementation of our treaty and inherent rights and our agreements is the foundation upon which we must build. Collectively, First Nations leaders made education our top priority. Our kids, just like every Canadian family's children, deserve good schools. That's basic. That's proof of respectful partnership. We are committed to financial accountability, yet this must be mutual accountability from the government as well. Former Auditor General Sheila Fraser undertook 32 audits related to First Nations, and she concluded that the quality of life conditions had actually gotten worse after her decade of study. Our people can make an enormous contribution to Canada if we tackle these obstacles. Our people are the youngest, the fastest growing community in a Canadian labour force that is rapidly aging. Closing the education and employment gaps for our people would contribute $400 billion to the national economy and save $115 billion in government expenditures. Many of our communities are already moving forward, taking economic matters in their own hands in sectors like clean energy, like technology. Like a rock, and I know the Prime Minister talked about a log, like a rock that sits in the middle of that road, a boulder that blocks the path of collaboration remains, as we've been saying here, the Indian Act, along with the age-old structures and policies that administer it and steadfastly resist change. And today, First Nations look to smash this status quo in tangible ways, seeking support for our pursuit of self-determination, not the limitations of departmentally driven policy and process. We seek fairness and respect for the rule of law, and this means recognition of our land rights and our title. Policies of denial and extinguishment have no place today and have cost Canada and First Nations billions in legal fees and lost opportunity as claims languish, blocking development of both our economies and indeed that of Canada. We struggle under layer upon layer of wasteful bureaucratic interference. Useless and expensive controls are piled upon our people, squandering tax dollars and frustrating change. Now we must turn this around. Increase the rate and pace of change so that all First Nations children can achieve success. We see today's gathering as only the first step in a commitment to a renewed relationship. Next must come the new fiscal relationships that guarantee and deliver sustainable, equitable services based on mutually agreed standards and shared responsibility. We need to build new structures and processes that affirm our relationship and uphold our responsibilities to one another. Structures that guarantee our ability to make the decisions that affect our lives and our lands, agreements that allow us and the Government of Canada to assume their responsibilities. Today, our young entrepreneurs, together with partners, can generate economic levers that rebuild our economies. At the same time, we must not forget the basic and very urgent needs that touch families most closely. As neighbours, we must all find a sense of community and extend a helping hand. So I can say with confidence, with certainty, that our work and the vision of our ancestors is not only possible, that it is underway. If we do our work here together, seriously, sincerely, if we follow it with a shared commitment to maintain and monitor progress toward the goals that we set out here, we will make that transformation. This is our time. It's our time to press forward, to push harder, to make real change. This is a struggle for the most vulnerable amongst us. This is a struggle for First Nations children from coast to coast to coast. Our success will be Canada's success. Our future is Canada's future. The step we take today, recalling the words of my late grandmother, an ability to see one another, is the first step. This recognition opens all possibilities. The possibility of a renewed dialogue as partners, a dialogue that honors who we are as nations and honors the spirit and intent of our treaties. A partnership that realizes the potential of Canada, a country founded on partnership and on respect. We made this country together. We can remake it in the spirit and the vision of our ancestors. And I invite all Canadians to join us. Let us ensure at this historic moment we do begin to rebuild trust, to renew faith, and to reconstruct the partnership of nations so courageously forged by our ancestors centuries ago. And in closing, I paraphrase our collective ancestors, more wise than us, upon concluding the agreement of friendship and alliances depicted in the gift that we presented here today. They took up a silver chain to represent the bond created and said, if ever that chain should tarnish, slip, or break, we must together brighten and strengthen it anew. This must be our collective pledge to move forward in strength and support, to create a better day for our children, and indeed all of Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, First Nations are ready to meet this challenge. We need and want Canada to work with us. Thank you.
All right, so we